It was almost 2 in the morning, and Daniel was still drowning. Paper covered every inch of his desk, and somewhere beneath it was a report due at sunrise. 3 years at the firm, and he was always the last one here, always buried. He told himself this was simply what ambition looked like. But 3 floors above him, a man had solved this exact problem and gone home before dinner. Same numbers. Same deadline. The difference between those 2 men was about to break every rule Daniel thought he knew about hard work. That man was the chief executive, and the cleaning crew traded stories about him. Every night he did the same strange thing. He would open a thick folder, read a single page, write one short line, and close it again. Then he switched off his lamp and went home, while the rest of the building glowed with panic. He read almost nothing, and yet somehow he always seemed to know more than anyone else in the room. Nobody could explain it. They simply shrugged and called it a gift. Daniel did not believe in gifts. He believed in effort, in staying late, in reading every word twice and then a third time to be safe. So when he stood alone in the empty atrium and looked up at that single lit window high above him, one question kept circling in his mind and would not let go. How did a man who read less somehow understand more? How did he move twice as fast on half the fuel? Daniel was about to find out. And the answer would feel almost unfair. To understand why it stung so much, you have to understand Daniel. He had joined the firm bright-eyed and hungry, certain that whoever worked the hardest would win in the end. And he did work hard. He read every attachment, memorized every figure, and walked into meetings with his head full to bursting. But lately the fullness had curdled into fog. He woke up tired. He forgot things he had read only the night before. The harder he pushed, the less seemed to stay. He could not admit it out loud, but quietly, he was beginning to sink. Mornings were the worst part. He would arrive early, arms aching under a tower of binders, and watch his colleagues breeze past him carrying nothing but a phone and a coffee. They laughed easily. They remembered names, numbers, whole conversations without effort. Daniel carried more than any of them, and somehow held on to less. He decided the answer must be to carry even more. Another notebook. Another folder. Another late night at the office. He was pouring water into a bucket riddled with holes, and calling the wasted effort a virtue. Then, on an ordinary Monday, everything changed. The executive stopped at Daniel's desk, glanced once at the mountain of paper, and said he wanted Daniel to shadow him for a full week. Daniel's heart leapt. Finally, a chance to prove himself. He immediately reached for his heaviest binder. But the older man shook his head slowly and said something Daniel would never forget. Bring nothing. No folders. No notes. You already carry far too much. And then he simply walked away, leaving Daniel staring at his own overloaded desk, more confused than honored. Of course, Daniel did not really listen. Old habits are always louder than good advice. The next morning he showed up outside the executive's office with a shoulder bag stuffed so full it would not zip, pages curling out of the top like autumn leaves. The executive looked at the bag, then at Daniel, and something between amusement and quiet pity crossed his face. He did not scold him. He simply opened the door and said, "Let us see how long you actually want to keep holding all of that." Then he gestured inside. "Come in." The first meeting was an ambush. 40 slides waited on the wall, each one dense with charts and numbers, and the presenter spoke fast. Daniel's pen flew across the page, chasing every figure, and his hand cramped within minutes. He wrote until his fingers ached, terrified of missing a single detail. And across the polished table, the executive did nothing at all. He did not write one word. He simply sat back, listening, calm, his hands folded, as though the flood of information were a gentle stream and he already knew exactly where it emptied out. Afterward, in the quiet of the hallway, Daniel finally asked the question that was burning a hole in him. How do you remember all of that? How do you keep every number in your head? The executive stopped walking, and a small, knowing smile crossed his face. That, he said, is exactly your mistake. I do not remember it. I never even try to. Daniel blinked, completely lost. It made no sense to him. If the man did not even try to remember, then how on earth could he know more than the person who had written down every single word? For an answer, the executive led him down a long corridor to a wall lined with white boards. Daniel expected genius scrawled across them, dense equations, some secret formula. Instead, each board held the very same simple shape. A handful of empty boxes, joined by a few arrows. That was all. No numbers. No lists. Just structure, clean and quiet and almost childishly plain. Daniel stared, waiting for the real trick to reveal itself. This is it, the executive said, spreading his hands. This is the whole secret. And Daniel had absolutely no idea yet what he was looking at. The executive tapped a single box with one finger. Your mind, he said, can only truly hold a few things at once. 4, maybe 5, before it begins to spill. Everyone knows this, and almost everyone ignores it completely. So they try to carry 100 loose facts around in their skull, and then they wonder why they feel so exhausted and so slow. I refuse to fight my own mind, he said. I decided long ago to hold almost nothing inside it. Instead, I hold this. He tapped the box once more. A place for each fact to live, so that I never have to carry the fact myself. He gave Daniel an example so small it felt almost foolish. Imagine a grocery list, he said. 20 items long. Try to memorize them in a straight row, and you will drop half of them before you reach the store. But sort them first. Fruit over here. Things that are cold. Things that come in cans. Suddenly 20 items become 4 little groups, and 4 is effortless. You did not get smarter, he said. You simply stopped asking your mind to do work that a little structure could do for it. Every report, every meeting, every problem you will ever face is just a grocery list waiting to be sorted. Daniel felt something quietly shift inside him. He thought of his own head in every meeting, crowded with loose pages, each fact shouting for attention, none of them connected to any other. And then he pictured the executive's mind instead, nearly empty, holding one clean diagram, calm as a still pond at dawn. It was not that the older man simply had more room up there. It was that he refused to fill the room at all. He kept his mind deliberately empty, so that when something truly mattered, there was actual space to think. Daniel had never once, in 3 years, left himself that kind of space. That night, buzzing with the new idea, Daniel tried it for himself. And he did it badly. Determined to be thorough, he drew not 4 boxes but 20. Then he split those 20 into even more. Arrows crossed over arrows until the whiteboard looked like a tangled spider's web. An hour later he was more lost than when he had started, and far more frustrated. He had taken a tool meant to lighten the load and somehow used it to build a heavier one. He sank into his chair among the mess, feeling like a fool who had been handed a key and still could not find the door. The next day he confessed the failure, half expecting to be laughed out of the room. The executive only nodded, as if he had been waiting for exactly this moment. You did what almost everyone does, he said gently. You tried to hold the boxes too. The point is not to draw more of them. The point is to draw fewer. If you have 20 boxes, you have simply written a longer list. Force yourself down to 4. If a 5th one appears, then one of those was never really separate to begin with. Simplicity is not what is left when you run out of things to add. It is what is left when you finally stop being afraid to remove. Then the executive did something Daniel did not expect at all. He sat down and began to talk about himself, 30 years earlier. A young man just like Daniel, he said. Always the last to leave. Always drowning. Utterly convinced that his own suffering was the truest proof of his dedication. I nearly burned out completely, he admitted, before an older woman, my very first mentor, sat me down one evening and drew 4 little boxes on a paper napkin. She told me I was not weak. She told me I was simply carrying a weight that no single person is ever meant to carry alone. It took me years to believe her, he said. I am hoping it takes you far less time than it took me. There's one final piece, the executive said, walking to the tall window. Once your whole world is sorted into a few clear boxes, You can stop trying to remember answers altogether. You start carrying a single question with you instead. Where does this new thing belong? That is all. Every email, every number, every small crisis becomes one quiet act of placing, rather than memorizing. He looked out over the city as the evening lights came on, one by one across the darkening skyline. I do not walk around holding 1,000 facts, he said softly. I walk around holding one good question. And that is exactly why my head stays light enough to actually think. Daniel went home that night and began again, slower this time, and far gentler with himself. 4 boxes. Only 4. Each evening that week he practiced, and each evening the tangled web loosened a little more. He stopped trying to remember everything and started simply trying to place it. At first it felt clumsy, like writing with the wrong hand. But by the 3rd night, something in his chest quietly nodded. The old panic that used to rise as the paper piled higher simply did not come this time. He was no longer fighting the flood at all. He was calmly giving every single thing a place to land. Then came the night it finally clicked into place. The same crushing avalanche of documents landed on his desk, the kind that once guaranteed no sleep at all. But Daniel did not read them the old, drowning way. He drew 4 boxes on his board, and then, one by one, he dropped each page into wherever it truly belonged. He was not memorizing anymore. He was sorting. Whatever refused to fit anywhere, he read closely and carefully. Whatever did fit, he simply placed and let go of entirely. For the very first time, the pile in front of him was not a threat. It was just laundry, waiting patiently to be folded. By midnight, the tower of paper was completely gone. Not crammed desperately into his memory, not carried around in his aching, overloaded head. Placed. Sorted. Set down. Daniel leaned back in his chair, and the whole office was silent around him, and for the first time in longer than he could honestly remember, so was his mind. There was no frantic list running behind his eyes, no single fact clawing for his attention. Just quiet, and a strange, unfamiliar lightness. He had done less work that night than ever before in his life. And yet he understood far more than he ever had. The change showed itself long before he ever spoke a word about it. He began arriving in the mornings with a single slim folder instead of an armful of straining binders. He walked lighter. He remembered names again, and the delicate thread of long conversations, precisely because his mind was no longer clogged with everything else at once. His colleagues noticed almost immediately. They asked if he had been away on holiday, if he had finally slept, what on earth had gotten into him. He only smiled and told them he had stopped trying to carry the entire building around inside his head. They laughed, certain it was a joke. It was not one. The real test came a full month later, in front of the entire board. Daniel was asked to brief the room on a tangle of numbers that would have buried his old self for a solid week. He walked in carrying no notes whatsoever. Just 4 boxes, held quietly and clearly in his mind. And then he spoke. Calmly, cleanly, connecting each piece to the next, because he was not reciting brittle facts, he was simply walking through a structure that he genuinely understood. He finished in half the time anyone in the room had expected. And when he finally looked up, the silence around the table had nothing at all to do with boredom. The senior leaders leaned forward in their chairs. One of them asked a hard, pointed question, the kind specifically designed to expose a gap, and Daniel answered it without flinching for even a second, because he was not clinging to a fragile stack of memorized lines that a single question could topple over. He was standing firmly on structure, and structure does not wobble. At the very back of the room, near the door, the executive watched with his arms folded and the faintest trace of pride softening his face. He said nothing at all. He did not need to. He had witnessed this exact moment once before, many years ago, from the other side of the table. Later that week, a younger analyst caught Daniel in the hallway, arms full of binders, eyes ringed with exhaustion, and asked him how he did it. How he stayed so calm, so fast, so clear under all that pressure. Daniel recognized that look instantly, because it had been his own not so very long ago. He did not hand the young man a clever trick or a shortcut. He simply picked up a marker, drew 4 empty boxes on the nearest glass wall, and said quietly, "Your mind can only hold a few things at once. So stop asking it to hold absolutely everything. Start right here." And just like that, the wheel had quietly turned once more. On Daniel's very last evening shadowing him, the executive took him all the way up to the roof. The whole city burned gold beneath them, and for a long while neither man said anything at all. Then the older man finally spoke the words that Daniel would carry with him for the rest of his life. "I was never faster than you," he said quietly. "I was never smarter either. I simply stopped carrying what a page could carry for me. That was the entire edge. Not a bigger memory. Not some rare and lucky gift. Just the plain courage to set things down, and to trust that they would still be there waiting whenever I truly needed them." Daniel lingered on the roof a while after the executive had gone, watching the very last of the light drain from the sky. He thought about all the endless nights he had spent drowning, genuinely believing that the weight itself was somehow the whole point. And he understood now, finally, that it never once had been. The mind is not a warehouse to be stuffed full until it groans and breaks. It is a workshop, and a workshop does its finest work when it is nearly empty. The people who seem to glide through the world twice as fast are not holding twice as much. They have simply learned, quietly, what to put down. And that, in the very end, is the unfairest advantage of them all.